Thank you very much. So I actually retitled my talk. Originally, I called it, Did Jewish Jokes Migrate, or Did They Migrate West? But as I wrote it, I realized I was saying something a little different, so I would like to call the talk instead, Do Jewish Jokes Make People Jewish? Right? Okay. So I want to use my time today to try out some ideas that I'm hoping to use for a book project. I'm just starting this book, and it's not really, I haven't decided a lot of things about the book, and I really would welcome any suggestions that you might have after you hear the talk about my ideas I express, maybe ideas I should express. And also, after the talk, I would love to hear any Jewish jokes that you might have. I especially feel that this project needs more Polish Jewish jokes, and I'm hoping I'm in the right place to find out about those. So I want to start by telling a joke. And I'll tell a joke, and then I'll talk a lot about that joke and about Jewish jokes in general. And then I'll tell more jokes with less explanation. So there will be the percentage of jokes to argument will go up over the course of the lecture. So this is a joke that I heard recently from an old lady at my synagogue after, so it's in California, in Northern California. I heard it after I gave a talk there about Jewish jokes. So this is her joke. My grandfather, she said, immigrated to the United States from Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. And in the United States, he went into business, and he did pretty well. And he decided that he wanted to go back to Russia and visit. So he booked passage on an ocean liner, a big steamship, to go back to Russia. So on these big ocean liners, these passenger ships, you get told where you're going to sit for dinner. So you get assigned a spot at the table, and you eat every night at dinner next to the same people. So he went down the first night, and he sat down, and next to him was a Frenchman. And the Frenchman turned to him and said, Bon appétit. And my grandfather said to the Frenchman, Goldberg. And the next night, the same thing happened. My grandfather went down to the dining room. He sat down. There was the Frenchman. The Frenchman said to him, Bon appétit. And my grandfather said to him, Goldberg. Then my grandfather started to wonder, what was the Frenchman saying? Was Bon appétit really his name? So he asked the purser on the ship, and the purser explained, this is why he's saying Bon appétit. And my grandfather, who was a smart guy, just not very educated, he said, ha ha. So the third night, my grandfather went down to the dining room, and he sat down, and there was the Frenchman, and my grandfather turned to him, and he said, Bon appétit. And the Frenchman said to my grandfather, Goldberg. So I actually want to ask you all a question. What do you think? What makes this a Jewish joke? And you can answer in English, and I'll understand. If you can answer in very slow Polish, I'll understand. Or you can answer in fast Polish, and they'll translate it, and then I'll understand through the headphones. So, anyone want to say why they think this is a Jewish joke? Is it a Jewish joke?
Is it a Jewish custom to introduce yourself whenever you meet someone new for the first time?
Oh, okay. Okay, so I see maybe, I saw someone disagreeing, so maybe there's something Jewish about introducing yourself. Maybe this is it's a Jewish joke because it's about a Jewish behavior, right? That would be an argument. Any other arguments? What makes this a Jewish joke? Goldberg. Ah, aha. The name, right? The name Goldberg, so vocabulary, and especially proper names, allow us to identify this joke as Jewish. Any other theories?
I have heard this joke joke is a Polish joke, Kowalski.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
Same joke.
So this is such an interesting thing, right? A lot of Jewish jokes that we maybe recognize as Jewish jokes also circulate as jokes about other people who might find themselves in the same situation. For instance, immigrating to the United States, not knowing French, going back to the old country on a steamship, right? Obviously, this is also the Polish experience. And so long as you have a nice, easily recognizable Polish last name like Kowalski, you can make the same joke about Poles. Any other theories? One in the back.
Goldberg is able to learn that the Frenchman can't learn.
What do you mean the Frenchman can't learn? He learns.
He should have known Goldberg is a name.
Ah, yes, okay. So this is the question. What should people already have known? What is it about Jewish words or Jewish names that should be already recognizable? And is this joke maybe about that question of what's recognizable? Okay, so this talk is going to be about what makes this joke and other jokes Jewish. It makes sense to define, and a lot of people do define, Jewish jokes in a kind of clear way. They say Jewish jokes are jokes told by Jews, so they're not sort of folkloric, funny stories told exclusively by non-Jews, right? Or sort of Christian peasant, Slavic peasant images of Jews. No, Jewish jokes have to be jokes told by Jews. They're jokes told about Jews. And they're jokes that refer in some way to Jewish culture, Jewish behavior, Jewish habits, or Jewish history. So clearly, the Goldberg joke qualifies according to that definition. I heard it from a Jewish person. It's about a Jew who does typically Jewish things, like immigrating from Russia to the United States, being named Goldberg, right? These are typically Jewish things. But in this talk, I actually don't want to kind of be limited to that definition of Jewish jokes. And I think it's a complex, it sounds like a good definition to say Jewish jokes are those told by Jews about Jews. But actually, when you look at it carefully, you see all these limitations to that definition. First of all, what does it mean to say a joke is Jewish if it's told by a Jew? Well, who are Jews? Are converts, for instance, Jewish? There's lots and lots of famous tellers of Jewish jokes who are converts from Judaism to Christianity. Do they count or not? And then there's the problem of the way that jokes circulate, right? Jokes are folklore. They don't have, by definition, as folklore, they don't have a named author, right? A single named author. So you see jokes in collections put together by Jews, jokes that may have been originally composed by non-Jews. You see collections of jokes put together by non-Jews that contain jokes perhaps written by Jews. So the this boundary of that was a joke. This boundary of what's a Jew who tells a joke is very difficult to really establish firmly. And then also this question of what does it mean to say jokes reflect Jewish experiences when, as pointed out by the gentleman in the pink shirt, the Jewish experience can be shared with non-Jews. If the Jewish experience is the same as the Polish experience and there's a Jewish joke that's also a Polish joke, does that mean it doesn't count as a Jewish joke, right? So this definition that Jewish jokes are jokes told by Jews about the Jewish experience, it's not that reliable, I think. So what I want to do is think in different ways during this talk about what it means to say something is a Jewish joke. And I think that maybe we should think that instead of saying that Jewish jokes reflect the Jewish experience, we might want to say or suggest that Jewish jokes create the Jewish experience, or they confirm or create the category of who is a Jew. So I want to start out by telling you some broadly accepted, sort of popular theories about Jewish jokes. These theories tend to fall into two camps. Some people say there have been Jewish jokes as long as there have been Jews. Jewish jokes are very old. And starting in the 1890s, people, writers of different kinds in different countries, started to produce arguments using evidence from many different kinds of sources, medieval Jewish sources, the Talmud, Jewish folklore. And they used these arguments, they used these sources to argue that Jews have always been persecuted and they have always responded with jokes. They have thereby transcended their difficult situation, and they have, through laughter, in a sense, defended themselves from their enemies. People keep making this kind of argument today. This is a very popular argument. For instance, in a book that came out last year in English, Jeremy Dauber's book, Jewish Comedy, A Serious History, he argues that many of the themes in 20th and 21st century Jewish humor, these themes are very old. They can be tied to ancient Jewish culture. They have been around since at least the composition of the Book of Esther, if not longer. So from this perspective, if Jewish jokes are a way that Jews respond to persecution and difficulties, then maybe what makes the Goldberg joke Jewish is that Goldberg is so persistent and resilient, right? You can't keep him down. Okay. Then there's another broad class of arguments about Jewish jokes that present Jewish jokes as something negative. So it's a set of arguments that focus on the fact that Jewish comedians, or comedians who in some way can be defined as Jewish, tend to tell jokes making fun of Jews. Most famously, Sigmund Freud in 1905 wrote in his book about humor that there's something distinctively, and maybe disturbingly, Jewish about telling these kind of self-accusatory, self-critical jokes. Freud wrote, quote, "I do not know whether there are many other instances of a people making fun to such a degree of its own character." Freud actually loved Jewish jokes, and he collected Jewish jokes, but people have used an argument like Freud's to say that actually Jewish jokes are bad for the Jews. Jewish jokes, when people tell jokes making fun of Jews, making fun of Jews' shortcomings, this fosters anti-Semitism, or at least it fosters disrespect for Jews. This argument, like the first argument I talked about, this argument also persists to this day. In a book, also in English, by Ruth Wise, published in 2013, a book called No Joke, Making Jewish Humor, Wise argues that now that Jews have their own state, the state of Israel, they should stop making those jokes. Those diasporic jokes that make fun of Jews and make Jews seem to be different from other nations. So if we focus on that, the sort of self-critical aspect of Jewish jokes, we could say that the Goldberg joke is a typical Jewish joke because it's making fun of Goldberg because he doesn't know French. He doesn't know this very basic bit of French. Bon appétit. So I think that instead of trying to decide whether Jewish jokes are good for the Jews or bad for the Jews, we should think more about the history of the Jewish joke. And in making this argument, I'm not the first one to make this kind of argument. I'm following some other scholars. Some folklorists from the 1970s and 80s who argue that maybe it's a mistake to think that the Jewish joke is essentially different from any other kind of ethnic joke. And I'm also following the work of some historians in the last few years who have produced some detailed studies of how Jewish jokes work in a specific time, a specific place. So there's a good book about Jewish jokes in Berlin in the first half of the 19th century, and there's a really great book about Jewish jokes in Budapest in the second half of the 19th century. And I think these these books really help me. And these scholars show that Jewish humor actually changes over time. Jewish humor, the concept of the Jewish joke, arises in different times and places for specific reasons, in specific contexts. These books suggest that it's when the social category of Jews becomes visible to society as a whole that people start to notice Jewish jokes, that Jewish jokes become a genre, a thing. Right? This is maybe my argument, so I want to repeat it, right? It's when the social category of Jews becomes visible to society as a whole that people start to notice Jewish jokes, that Jewish jokes, Jewish humor becomes a genre, becomes a thing. I think Jewish jokes start to matter when they become a popular commercial culture phenomenon. So popular commercial culture starts, I think we can argue, and I'm speaking broadly, it starts maybe in the 19th century when you get a lot of people living in cities with some leisure time and some money to pay for entertainment. And they use that money to go to cheap stage productions, and they also use that money to buy newspapers and books. And this is, of course, an era of rising literacy. So the story that I want to tell, the story of the Jewish joke, is a story about people and things on the move. It's a story about migration, urbanization, and it's also a story about technology. So the mid-19th century is a time when paper gets much cheaper. Paper starts to be produced mechanically more than by hand, so it gets cheaper, and also you start getting these steam-driven printing presses, which makes printing much cheaper and faster. And of course, steam also drives the trains and the steamships that allow for the faster movement of people. And people on trains tend to want to have some entertainment to pass the time, and therefore they tend to buy cheap books. So train travel fosters the growth of the popular press, right? It fosters the growth of kind of lowbrow, cheap books, and sort of historians have shown that when you get train travel is when you get bookstores set up in train stations where people buy cheap books. So the 19th century, the mid-19th century, is especially a time of movement for European Jews. This is when Jews are moving out of the shtetls to bigger cities in the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, to German-speaking cities outside the Russian Empire. And then, pretty soon, they start moving outside of Eastern Europe to England and to especially the United States. Among the people traveling on steam trains and steamships and buying cheap reading material, therefore, are a lot of Jews. So it's not surprising that this new popular commercial culture, new popular lowbrow writing, includes a lot of depictions of Jews who have recently migrated, or Jews who are in the process of migrating, Jews who are newcomers to big cities. So from that perspective, the Goldberg joke is still a Jewish joke because it's maybe about the reality of Jews in the early 20th century, Jews who are traveling by steamship and who are learning new languages. So these things all taken together, the migration of Jews, the rise of commercial popular culture, these things allow people, meaning both Jews and non-Jews, to understand the category of Jew, the social category of Jew, in a new way. And they do this using language. So, in order to explain this, I want to use a kind of jargon-type word, but I think it's useful. It's the word enregisterment. Enregisterment. So, the linguistic anthropologist Asif Aga uses this word, enregisterment, to describe the ways in which, quote, a linguistic repertoire becomes differentiable within a language as a socially recognized register of forms. Okay, that was very academic sounding, but what it means is, like, we English speakers know that there's a certain way of speaking English, received pronunciation in Britain, that means that a person is educated. You speak English in a certain way, and people know that you are a high-class person. Anthropologists talk about the way that we use things about the people we see to tell what class they belong to. They use the word to index, right? So we use someone's clothes or their body or their behavior to index them as a certain kind of person, as fitting into a certain social category. For instance, if a person wears glasses, you might think that person is an intellectual, right? We're all intellectuals here. So that's a form of indexing, right? And language is a really important form, it's a really important device for indexing. How you speak, your register, lets people index you as a certain kind of person, a certain type of person. So Asif Aga explains that the sense in a society that a certain kind of language, a certain way of speaking, makes you a certain kind of person, that notion arises historically at a certain moment, and we can historicize it. We can trace it. We can find it. And popular commercial culture is part of this process. So this is enregisterment. It's that moment when people in a society all start to agree, oh yes, if you speak that way, that means you're high class. If you speak that way, that means you're not high class. You know, maybe you belong to some other group. And this really depends on popular culture, so in popular commercial culture. So in England, for received pronunciation, already in the late 18th century, there were these etiquette manuals that were telling people you should talk in a certain way, you should speak English in a certain way to be high class. But it was only when you started to get popular commercial books in the mid-19th century that this notion of a certain kind of pronunciation being high class that was described in this popular commercial culture started to be really widespread. Right? Everyone started to agree. This is how you speak to be high class. And so it's a story about the second half, especially of the 19th century. The linguistic anthropologist Miyako Inoue tells a really similar story about another register, about the way that urban women in Japan speak Japanese. So apparently there's this moment at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, where Japanese people start to think, yeah, she's talking that way, and that makes her that kind of urban woman, right? So the language, that register starts to appear, it gets enregistered. And this happens with the rise of popular commercial culture. So, back to Jews, away from England and Japan. So I have another question for you. What about Jews? Do Jews speak in a distinctive way? Can you tell, and I'm not talking about Yiddish and Hebrew and Jewish languages, but when Jews are speaking non-Jewish languages, when they're speaking English or Russian or Polish or German, what do you think? Do they speak in a distinctive way? Hyman Kaplan. Oh, yes, I'm going to get to Hyman Kaplan. Yes, okay, but wait for Hyman Kaplan.
Woody Allen.
Woody Allen, okay, so what do you think about Woody Allen?
He's this neurotic New Yorker who is always worried and insecure, and he just feels like he has to compensate for what he perceives as weaknesses to be funny and to seem very intelligent. Or self-deprecating, okay?
Yeah, so
which is funny. Okay.
His speech is funny and self-deprecating, and therefore he speaks that funny self-deprecating way of speaking is Jewish English, and it indexes him as Jewish. Is that your argument?
It's a New York Jewish intelligentsia, okay?
Yes.
And one of the best lines I remember from Woody Allen is, "I wouldn't want to belong to." Oh no, that's Groucho Marx.
That's
I would
Groucho
want to belong to a club that would want me for a member, okay? But
Yes.
Woody Allen says this again. Okay?
Yes, and so this is an Asif Aga. So this is something that Asif Aga says, is that when registers are indexed or are kind of enregistered, when a certain way of speaking is enregistered as meaning you're a certain kind of person, what gets enregistered is these very specific lines, very specific devices, little bits of phonetics that symbolize something bigger. Like Groucho Marx saying, I wouldn't belong to any club that would have me as a member, is that something that can become part of the enregisterment of Jewish English or New York Jewish English, right? And can start to be a way that you can index Groucho Marx as Jewish. Any other arguments? Maybe we can have a show of hands. Who thinks, can everyone raise their hands if they think that they can tell, at least sometimes, from the way someone speaks that they're Jewish? No hands, no hands. You can never tell. Oh, yes, a few people. Sort of embarrassing to admit, maybe. Okay, yes. Okay, what's the comment over here?
I was just going to say, yeah. I think it's in the show Frasier that there's like an episode where they're like, oh, it's the Jewish style to always answer a question with a question. You know? But I forgot exactly what it was, but something like that.
Okay, so that was just an argument that Jewish English, or maybe Jewish speech more broadly, is recognizable because it has this device of answering a question with a question, right? Yes.
When Jews moved from Yiddish to the language of the country in which they lived, this was often seen as a deformation of the language. In German, to Mauscheln, in Polish, Jedlaczyć, and many other examples.
Yeah. So we have, especially in Eastern Europe, we have these verbs and nouns that are used for referring to Jewish register, right? Something that doesn't exist in English. In English, you can just say, oh, that person is speaking Jewish English, right? But then in some languages, you have a whole vocabulary for talking about this notion of a Jewish way of speaking.
There's
Yes.
a whole set of Polish jokes, schmonzes, which rest on the inability to decline Polish correctly, which is actually quite hard for a non-Polish speaker, native speaker. of Polish.
Yes, tell me about it. Okay, maybe one more. Yes.
When I was in Odessa on research, maybe I'm mistaken, but sometimes it seemed to me that people speaking Odessa Russian, some of them really speak with the Yiddish syntax. Yeah. So this is something, maybe I just imagine it, but it really sounded like Yiddish syntax.
Yeah. So we're getting all these ideas about many different things that might be part of Jewish language, right? It could be an attitude, like self-deprecating. It could be a kind of use of a certain grammatical form, like questions. It could be sort of consistent, imprecise, non-standard ways of declining something, or it could be the syntax, right? So I want to take you through several theories about this notion of Jewish language or Jewish register. So here are the theories that I've found where people are trying to answer this question of, do Jews speak in a distinctive way? On the one hand, maybe Jews don't really sound different from anyone else. Maybe they're just represented as sounding different. Maybe they're represented as sounding different because some people are invested in Jewish difference. Especially anti-Semites are invested in Jewish difference. They want to hear Jews as sounding different, and so they do hear Jews as sounding different, even when those Jews maybe speak exactly the same way they do. The literary critic Sander Gilman is a proponent of this argument. He says, quote, Jews sound different because they are represented as being different, right? There's no there. That's one argument. Here's another argument. Maybe Jews, or at least some Jews, do speak in a distinctive way, especially Jews who come from places where there are a lot of Jews. So the linguist Deborah Tannen studies Jews from New York, and she finds that their speech has certain consistent characteristics: fast pacing, interruption, emphasis on the speaker's emotions, and high volume. Another linguist, also named Deborah Safran, who studies Jews from Philadelphia, finds something similar. She demonstrates that Jewish English is characterized by a preference for argument and disagreement. So that's another argument, right? There is such a thing as Jewish language, at least Jewish English. Okay, here's another argument. Maybe Jews and other people speak in distinctive ways some of the time, but not all of the time. They perform Jewish register when they want to, or when it makes sense for them to, when it's appropriate for them to perform Jewish register. The sociolinguist Sarah Benor is a proponent of this argument. She says that Jewish speech style is used selectively, and it's used selectively both by Jews and by non-Jews. So let's get back to enregisterment. I think we can isolate a moment in the 19th century when Russians, Germans, and other Europeans enregister Jewish language or Jewish register as a speech style characterized by loudness, prolixity, right, using lots of words, combativeness, emotionality, and energetic gestures. Those same elements that Tannen and Safran notice among New York and Philadelphia Jews, and that Benor thinks that some Jews perform some of the time, but they do it on purpose for effect. And Jewish jokes, when they're performed, whether they're performed on the stage or they're circulating in cheap publications, Jewish jokes make this kind of enregisterment possible. From this perspective, what's Jewish about the Goldberg joke is that it's on a steamship that he speaks in a way that's recognizable as Jewish. He's part of that modern world of steam travel and circulation, and that's where his speech style is, at least initially, recognizable as different from that of other people on the steamship, at least the Frenchmen. So now that I've explained all these concepts, popular commercial culture, enregisterment, the idea of Jewish speech difference, I want to go back to my argument. So I initially, as I said, titled this talk, Did Jewish Jokes Migrate? And some people think, some scholars think that Jewish jokes did migrate, that the Jewish jokes of Berlin in the 1840s are just transferred to the United States, and that's why you get Jewish jokes in the United States from around 1900. But I actually disagree. I don't think Jewish jokes migrate. Rather, in a kind of way like Goldberg on the ship, like they just move from one place to another, I don't think that that's what happens. I think that really Jewish humor becomes identifiable. It becomes significant, it becomes visible or audible in different places at different times. And that's that happens as part of the enregisterment of Jewish speech style. It happens when Jewish speech style becomes recognizable. And I think this is why there are so many Jewish jokes that are about Jewish voice and Jewish speech style, and there are so many Jewish jokes that are about recognition or misrecognition. So that's why I decided to retitle this talk, Do Jewish Jokes Make People Jewish? So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to do three things. First, I'll give you a little history of the Jewish joke from the early 19th century through the 1920s. Second, I'll talk about the ways that jokes about Jewish speech are still told today. And I'll conclude by suggesting that the enregisterment of Jewish speech style, or any speech style, can generate a kind of afterlife, as people start to ask whether what seem to be the natural features of a group of people are actually changeable. So here's the history of the modern Jewish joke, illustrated by jokes. So the story of the modern Jewish joke appears to begin in German-speaking places between the 1820s and the 1850s, especially Berlin. And it's associated with journalism, with the journalism of Heinrich Heine, Ludwig Börne, and Moritz Safir. People see these three men as producing, people saw them at the time, right, in the first half of the 19th century in Berlin, they saw them as producing a distinctive kind of humor, a distinctive kind of Jewish joke, which was called Judenwitz. So the Judenwitz is satirical, aggressive, cynical, and connected to the marketplace. So here's an example. My German is really bad, so it was really hard for me to find a good example, but I have this big book of jokes by Safir, and I looked under J for Juden, jokes about Jews, and this is what I found. An officer fell off his horse on the open street. A Jew was nearby, and he said to him, "Herr Offizier, that would not have happened to me." The officer says, "What, Jew? Are you a better rider than I am?" "No," said the Jew, "but I wouldn't have gotten on that horse." So this joke is a little bit like the Goldberg joke in that it brings together two people from different backgrounds who kind of confuse each other and speak different languages. So that's the kind of 1820s through 1850s. And then in the 1860s, you have a slightly different kind of Jewish joke that appears in lots of places. In Budapest, especially, from the late 1860s, you have a lot of Jewish jokes being told on the stage and also being printed in cheap magazines, cheap humor magazines, and you see them using Mauschel, right, using this kind of version of German that sounds Jewish. These jokes seem to be circulated by people who are Jewish, right? And there's, as I think I mentioned, there's a really wonderful book about this by the historian Mary Gluck, a book called The Invisible Jewish Budapest. So I recommend it. Mary Gluck says that these jokes are, they're using a linguistic strategy that's typical of minorities who gain access to a social mainstream through comedy, and especially through reappropriation. That means taking the negative stereotypes about them that are circulating in mainstream society and then reusing those negative stereotypes for their own purposes. So reappropriation is a common technique of minorities, and I think we see it, in the US today. I'm sure you see it everywhere. So late 1860s, certainly by the 1870s in Russia, you have a lot of books of Jewish humor circulating. You have Jewish jokes being told on the stage. And you have these books of Jewish humor that tend to be called something like Scenes from Jewish Life. The most successful author of these books of comic scenes from Jewish life was Pavel Weinberg. He was a comic actor on the Petersburg stage. He was a man from Odessa, someone with Jewish roots, as you can tell from his last name, since we're sensitive to last names. But he had been baptized as an infant, right? So he's officially a Christian. His characters, the characters in his books of jokes, speak Russian with a Jewish accent, and they constantly draw attention to the non-standardness of their language, right, to the ways that they don't speak proper Russian. So here is one of the jokes from one of Weinberg's collections of Jewish jokes. It's a joke called The White Swan. So in a shtetl, you have a group of Yiddish-speaking Jews, and they decide that they want to go to the Russian administration of their town, the police chief, and they want to tell him that they like him and that they're grateful for something that he's done for them. So they come up with a speech in Russian about how good he is, and they include in their speech the phrase, "We hope that your time in office goes as smoothly as a white swan swims." But on the way, as they walk toward the police office, they forget the words White Swan. So when they get to the police chief, one of them, the one who had been delegated to make the speech, starts to make the speech. And then he says, "We hope that your time in office goes as well." And he doesn't remember the word White Swan. So the other Jews who are present give him suggestions. They say, "We hope you swim as well as a chicken." And he says, "No, I'm not going to say chicken," to the police chief. "Say duck." "I'm not going to say duck." "What about dog?" "No." So he keeps trying, nothing comes out. Finally, the police chief is very irritated, and he chases the Jews out of his office. And as they're leaving, the one who is giving the speech remembers the words White Swan. So he runs back into the police chief's office, and he yells at him, "Your most honorable honor, excuse me, like a white swan." And he slams the door, and he runs out. So what's funny here, I think, is just the process of language learning. And in that way, I think this joke actually is something like the Goldberg joke. And actually, I heard a wonderful talk today about Latvian literature and images of Jews in Latvian literature. And I understood that a lot of the tropes, a lot of the scenes in Weinberg's scenes from Jewish life are very close to what you would see in Latvian short comic scenes about Jews, also from the 1860s and 70s. So this is what's happening in sort of this in Eastern Europe. West of Eastern Europe, people haven't yet figured out that Jews are funny. But in the 1890s, they start to get the message. So it's in the 1890s that this notion of Jewish comedy as a thing, Jewish humor, starts to spread. And we see this because Herman Adler, the chief rabbi of Britain, wrote an essay in 1893 about Jewish humor. And he says, he starts out by saying, some people think Jews aren't funny. Those people are wrong. Actually, he says, Jews have a faculty for saying witty and humorous things, which they've developed as a result of the hardships that they have faced. Right? So this is a good example of these writings from the 1890s that say, let's look at the whole history of Jewish texts. We can see this consistent theme of Jews being funny because they've been persecuted. Right? But they only start to write these things in the 1890s. So the first big migration of Jews from Eastern Europe to the United States is not, the first big migration of Jews from Eastern Europe to the United States is in the mid-19th century. It's the Jews from Germany who come after 1848. But interestingly, their arrival in the United States does not trigger the publication of Jewish joke books in English, right? In fact, the sort of appearance of something that looks like Jewish humor that's recognized as the Jewish joke in the United States happens only after the even larger migration of Jews from the Russian Empire, which starts in 1881, 82, and is really enormous by the late 1880s, 1890s. And it's in the late 1890s that you start to get publications of Jewish joke books in English, books called things like Cooper's Yankee, Italian, and Hebrew dialect readings, or Carey's Hebrew yarns and dialect humor, which are from 1891 and 1900, respectively. So here's a joke from one of those collections, from Carey. So it's from 1900. A customer brings a pair of pants back to a Jewish tailor. And he says, "You sold me these pants, but they're no good." "Why are they no good?" "Because as soon as I put them on, all the buttons fell off." The tailor answers him, and he says, "No, actually, these pants are better than your average pants. They are very fashionable. They are, quote, the new Kodak pants. When the customer asks, what are those? What are Kodak pants? The tailor explains, you press the buttons and we do the rest. So this joke is based on an 1888 advertising slogan. You press the buttons and we do the rest, right? This is a slogan for a new kind of camera produced by the Kodak factory in Rochester, New York. How many people here have used Kodak film? At some point? Yeah, okay. So this was a new thing, that you had these cameras that had the film inside, and you would send the camera, the entire camera, back to the Kodak factory in Rochester, New York, and then you would get your camera back along with your developed images. So you would not have to develop your film yourself. Right, that was an innovation, and it was very successful for Kodak, right? So this joke, I think, is really interesting because it situates the Jew in the world of commerce, a world whose language he's manipulating to his own advantage when he claims that a defect in his product, these buttons that fall off the pants, actually make the product better and more appealing. So this is kind of like the Goldberg joke, I think, in that it references technology and it references commerce. What happens next with this concept of the Jewish joke and Jewish humor? I really love a citation I found in Sholem Aleichem from the early 20th century, from 1908, which I think kind of reflects on the process I'm talking about, the process of enregisterment and Jewish jokes. Sholem Aleichem was living in Switzerland in 1908, and one day, he says in a memoir, one day he went on a hike with 3 other Jewish writers, with the writers Mendele Moicher Sforum, Chaim Nachman Bialik, and Ben Ami. They're all hiking in the Swiss Alps, and periodically they sit down and they rest and they talk. And Sholem Aleichem describes what's happening in this way. The scene, he's describing the scene of him and his friends sitting on the grass in the Alps talking. He says, sometimes I'd like to be a non-Jew. Not permanently, of course, heaven forbid. I mean, just for a little while. And I'd look with my non-Jewish eyes and I'd see, what is it like when Jews are going and talking and making a racket and debating and waving their hands around? I mean, doesn't it seem that would be a very interesting picture? A completely ordinary conversation would almost certainly appear to me as though we were fighting and quarreling. Almost everyone we saw during our travels, including Frenchmen, Germans, and Englishmen, paused and looked at us, that's him and his friends, the other Jewish writers, paused and looked at us with wonder, as though we came from who knows where and were wearing who knows what kind of clothes. I think it was because we spoke just a bit too loud, and also partly because all 4 of us spoke at once. To speak all at the same time is an art that only we Jews possess. So I think this comment of Sholem Aleichem's is part of a pattern. I think that some early 20th century Jews, especially some Russian revolutionaries and writers, started to valorize a certain kind of Jewish speech, which they depicted as embodied, loud, emotional, hot, and somehow excessive, right? But they were valorizing that sense of excess. So this period that I'm describing, this period of the recognition and valorization in various ways of the Jewish joke or Jewish voice or Jewish register, this period, I think, draws to an end in the 19-teens. Of course, well before that, some Jews had been opposing the phenomenon that I'm describing. They had been opposing what they saw as the negative portrayals of Jews on the stage and in print. In 1897, Theodor Herzl attacks the comic use of Mauschel. Herzl saw Jewish jokes, and especially their use of Mauschel, as degrading, to Jews. Striking the same note, Russian liberal and Jewish journals attacked Weinberg and his jokes, and they especially disliked the White Swan joke. I actually, when I was reading Weinberg, I found some of the other jokes much more offensive, but the jokes that appeared offensive in 1870 to sort of assimilated Russian Jews in cities, the White Swan joke was the worst. They saw this kind of joke, as dangerous to Jews and as disrespectful. And this kind of opposition to derogatory Jewish jokes spread in the 19-teens. In the United States, American Jewish lobbying groups began to campaign against the derogatory characterization of the Jew in the theater and vaudeville. And they really pushed the more grotesque theater Jews off of the stage. And in the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks responded to the horrifying violence against Jews of the Civil War era by telling citizens to avoid anti-Semitic speech and to stop telling anti-Jewish jokes. This directive, of course, generated its own jokes, such as the following, in which someone wants to tell a Jewish joke, but they know they're not supposed to, so they mechanically substitute Chinese people for Jews. And you have these jokes that begin, 2 Chinese men come out of the synagogue, or 2 mandarins are going down the street in Peking, one turns to the other and says, Nu, Chaim. Other jokes of this kind involve Russians who have been instructed not to refer to Jews with the derogatory term Żyd, and instead to say Yevrei. And they respond by mechanically substituting Yevrei for Żyd, even in words where the meaning has nothing to do with Jews. So instead of saying Ожидаю, I wait, they say Yevreivаю. At the same time, Yiddish folklorists who had been collecting songs, sayings, legends from the 1890s, it's precisely around 1920 that they begin to publish collections of Jewish jokes. Emanuel Olsvanger published his first collection of Yiddish jokes in Basel in 1920. Shloime Bastomsky publishes Der Kundus, the Prankster, a series of collections of sayings, jokes, stories, and so on in Vilnius, starting in 1922. So I think we could argue with the sort of facts of publishing would suggest that one mode of Jewish joke, kind of dialect humor that's pretty negative, starts to diminish as another mode of Jewish humor, collections produced by folklorists in Yiddish, starts to grow. Okay. So I'm kind of turning toward the last section of my talk. I want to talk about Jewish jokes that thematize linguistic recognition. So what I find fascinating is the way that Jewish jokes draw attention to Jewish linguistic distinctiveness and to enregisterment. Sometimes in doing so, they display a real continuity with an older tradition. The linguist Max Weinreich explains one comic technique that you see in rabbinic argumentation, and that is the technique of nutriken, where a real word is interpreted as the initials of several words. For instance, Weinreich cites this joke, how do we know that a cantor is a fool? Because the word chazan, cantor, is an acronym of chazonim zenen naronim. Cantors are fools, right? One of Weinberg's jokes actually uses this same technique. It's hard to translate from Russian, but I'm going to try. So we're at a train station for one of the Southern Railroad lines, and there's a train car with the letters K, B, J, D on it, standing for Kiev Balta Railroad, right? Kieva Baltskaya Железная Дорога. A passenger goes by and he asks, what do those letters mean? K, B, J, D. Those letters, say a conductor who's trying to be funny, they mean, what a senseless Yid road. Какая бестолковая жидовская дорога. Excuse me, says a passing Jew. You Russians read from left to right. So for you, this means, what a senseless Yid wrote. But we Jews read from right to left. So for us, these letters come out, an idiot wants to be conductor. Durak желает быть кондуктором. So as in the White Swan joke, Jews here speak in a distinctive way. And here too, as in the White Swan joke, Jewish speech displays a kind of aggressive but masked response to the need to assimilate. Here's another joke that makes Jewish speech seem excessive. It's from Olsvanger. A Jewish woman is standing at the market holding a basket of eggs. An old Jewish woman comes up to her and says, "You know Chaya? Sora died." The Jewish woman says, "Take my basket." So the other woman takes her basket, and then the woman says, "Whoa, woe is me." So I actually heard a version of this story from a colleague of mine a couple years ago in California, in which two Jewish men meet in a bakery in the Soviet Union, and one of them says to the other, "Did you hear? Rabinovich died." And the other guy says, "Hold my bread." He takes his bread, and then the guy says, "Не может быть," you know, it can't be. So this kind of joke lives on. Another form of Jewish joke that sort of has these characteristics and that lives on is jokes about shifting intonation. This is the device underlying the very famous joke about the telegram from Trotsky. Who knows the joke about the telegram from Trotsky? Not so many people. Oh, okay, I'm going to have some pleasure telling it. So we're at a Politburo meeting, and a telegram, Stalin says, "Comrades, a telegram has come from Trotsky." Presumably Trotsky is already in Mexico, right? And Stalin says, "I'm going to read the telegram out loud." "Comrade Stalin, you were right. I was wrong. I should apologize. Sincerely, Trotsky." And then Rabinovich raises his hand and he says, "Comrade Stalin, you read it wrong. So you read it." So Rabinovich takes the telegram and he reads, "Comrade Stalin, you were right? I was wrong? I should apologize? Sincerely, Trotsky." So I was really delighted to hear another version of this same joke last year when Michael Krasny, a San Francisco radio host, came to Stanford to read from his new book about Jewish jokes. And he included this joke. A grandfather, so this is an American Jewish joke, a grandfather takes his grandson for a walk. They stop in front of a small lake with a big sign saying, "No swimming allowed," in large block letters. Below these words, the warning is repeated in even larger letters with exclamation marks. The grandfather takes his grandson's hand and he says, "Come on, we're going for a swim." The grandson is incredulous. "But Grandpa," he says, "it says no swimming is allowed. It says it twice." The grandfather replies, "No, it says no swimming allowed? No, swimming allowed." The linguist Max Weinreich says that Jews speaking all different languages use this form of rising intonation. We could also, so maybe there's something really consistent about this mode of joke. I think we could also see these intonation jokes as being about a feature of rabbinic reading and rabbinic argumentation. When you read a Talmud, when you read an ancient text that has no punctuation, one of the ways you read it is you try out where you think the words could be, the sentences could be ending, by reading it in multiple ways and varying your intonation as you read, right? I actually got this idea from our rabbinics professor at Stanford, Charlotte von Robert. But I think she's right. I think that there's something really sort of old and important about this mode of multiple intonations, alternative voicings. At the same time, I hear in the Trotsky telegram joke and the no swimming allowed joke, I hear the same kind of masked hostility, the same kind of over-enthusiastic but simultaneously obnoxious learning of a new language that I hear in the Kiev-Balta Railroad joke. And that same kind of excessive and overly aggressive language learning is everywhere in Leo Roston's series of jokes about the talkative Hyman Kaplan. So who besides me and Antony has read Hyman Kaplan stories? No, you should all read them. They're really good. So Hyman Kaplan is a recent immigrant from Poland to New York, and he's taking night classes in English, and he's conducting an endless, cheerful, kind of subversive war against his teacher, the exhausted Mr. Parkhill, and against the English language. The 1937 collection of stories, The Education of Hyman Kaplan, begins as Mr. Parkhill studies Kaplan's homework with concern. So here's a citation. The exercise was entitled 15 Common Nouns and Their Plural Forms. Mr. Parkhill came to one paper which included the following. House makes houses. Dog makes doggies. Library makes public library. Cat makes Katz, the last name, K-A-T-Z. And here's another citation. Only once did Mr. Parkhill feel that Mr. Kaplan might perhaps be a little more serious about his work. That was when he asked Mr. Kaplan to give a noun. Door, said Mr. Kaplan, smiling. It seemed to Mr. Parkhill that door had been given just a moment earlier by Miss Mitnick. Yes, said Mr. Parkhill. And another noun? Another door, Mr. Kaplan replied promptly. Here and throughout Roston's stories, Hyman Kaplan's language displays the attributes that Tannen and Safran associate with Jewish English. Fast pacing, interruption, emphasis on the speaker's emotions, and a preference for argument and disagreement. Although Mr. Kaplan is always smiling, Mr. Parkhill is often unnerved, and the stories as a whole suggest that even as he is seemingly trying to learn correct English, in fact, Kaplan is defiantly, if covertly, insisting that his own language, his Jewish register, is better. Conclusion. I promised that I'd conclude by talking about the afterlife of the enregisterment of Jewish speech style. I think that what I talked about shows that people can use jokes to suggest that standard language might not be something that everyone has to simply learn and accept. I think these jokes indicate that even as you learn a standard, high-status, hegemonic language, you can simultaneously disrupt that language. That is, I'm arguing that the jokes that I've considered, which are one subgenre of the Jewish joke, that these jokes acknowledge the work of enregisterment that they are part of, the making recognizable of Jewish register as a non-standard register of Russian, English, or German, and simultaneously these jokes valorize Jewish speech style, whether that be in Russian, German, English, or Yiddish. But that's not all they do. In their jocular depiction of the defiant language learner, these jokes indicate that language learning need not inevitably always go in one direction, where the speakers of the low-status language simply learn high-status language. In valorizing Jewish speech style, these jokes suggest that Jewish speech style might be a verbal device that a non-Jew could choose to use. And this is my final interpretation of the Goldberg joke. At the end, the Frenchman says, Goldberg. Thereby, I think, he too participates in the verbal excessiveness and the valorization of Jewish speech style characteristic of this subgenre of Jewish jokes. If Jewish jokes, as I've argued, are part of the process whereby people are recognized as Jews, then the Frenchman in the Goldberg joke has become Jewish too. Thank you. Okay. Questions? Jokes?
Can you say a joke in Russian language? Пожалуйста, по-русски. Много людей понимают.
Just any joke? Oh, can you say a joke? Yes, tell a joke in Russian. I do know Russian.
I think you're supposed to.
Should I tell a joke in Russian? Oh, I can speak Russian. Yes, should I tell a joke in Russian? Еврейский анекдот на русском. Любой еврейский анекдот. Ага, да. Но, может быть, я подумаю немножко. Найду хороший еврейский анекдот. Да. Может быть, другие вопросы? I'm sorry, maybe other questions while I think about a good Jewish joke that I can tell in Russian.
This is as much a comment as a question, but if you think of the Budapest Music Hall as described by Mary Gluck, what this is about is mocking the pretensions of the acculturated Jewish minority who went to these performances and very much liked being mocked in the company of other Budapest denizens, often from the country. People came from the noble estates to watch these performances. And the same, so it's not so much validating the language which has been given up, but mocking the pretensions of those who are trying to speak good German, which was the language of urban Budapest until the 1890s, or good Hungarian after the 1890s. And the same can be seen in Polish cabaret, particularly Warsaw cabaret, Morze Oko and so on, in the 1920s and 30s, much of which was written by people either of Jewish origin, like Hemmer, who was a convert, or by Slonimsky, who was very Jewish, although, as he said, he was a Jew of anti-Semitic antecedents, which also mocked the pretensions of the aspiring Jewish middle class, and they wouldn't have mocked these pretensions had they not, I mean, these jokes did not cease to be funny after a certain point. Tuvim's humor today, when he says, for instance, that the way to mock anti-Semitism is to make it look ridiculous, sounds rather sick when anti-Semitism surpasses any of the fantasies which Tuvim can create. But it was something which was produced in a time when people felt comfortable with this. The Hungarian Orpheum, the music hall, disappeared in the 1920s and 30s when the situation of Hungarian Jews deteriorated radically. The Polish cabaret, the schmonzes and the other sketzes began to disappear from in the late 1930s.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really important point, that there's a time when people are eager to go to these kind of lowbrow performances and see people like themselves but not exactly like themselves mocked, right? And I'm very fascinated by the way that the Russian Jewish jokes, like in the Weinberg collections, are similar to jokes about peasants from the 1860s, especially jokes published by this writer Ivan Gorbunov, who published these scenes from peasant life. And he also performed them on the stage, just as Weinberg did. And it seems pretty clear that those books were bought by peasant migrants to the cities, and the performances of jokes about peasants, those performances were attended by peasants, right? Peasant migrants to the cities. So there's something about people at certain moments in history enjoying seeing this precise kind of mockery of a group of people that they kind of identify with, or maybe identify with very fully.
Comment, if possible. I think that there is a huge similarity when you are speaking about the 19th century Jewish jokes and jokes, Gorbunov's jokes, especially about, for example, Russian merchants. Yes, we are speaking about the people who came from the lower class, from the ignorant, uncultural strata, who tried to cross the borders between the social classes, the social groups, what we call in Russian, excuse me for my poor English, what we call in Russian, выскочка.
Yeah.
And so it could be Jew, it could be a Russian merchant who has a lot of money, and because of his money he tried to be a part of aristocratic society. And he is funny now because a Jew, a merchant, because he has money and he pretends to be in another social strata, and it is funny. Yes, выскочка.
Yeah. I mean, but I don't know if you have to be you don't have to have gone up very far to be funny, right? Like these jokes about people going to the doctor. So you see these jokes about the Jew goes to a doctor and he doesn't know, like a Jewish migrant to a big city goes to a kind of modern doctor and he doesn't understand all these things about how to talk to the doctor. And there's exactly the same jokes about a peasant goes to the doctor, a Ukrainian goes to the doctor, an Armenian goes to the doctor. No one knows how to go to the doctor, right? But you don't have to be very, you've only made a tiny kind of transgression upwards in your social status to try to go to a doctor, right? But it's like all the 19th century jokes about going to the opera. You know, the Jews don't know how to behave at the opera, the peasants don't know how to behave at the opera. So there's certain scenes that trigger this sort of joke, and they trigger that sort of joke for all sorts of groups in Russia, in the Russian Empire, and also very much in the United States. Like jokes about people who don't know how to behave at the opera are very popular in the US at exactly the same time when they're very popular in the Russian Empire. Yeah?
I would like to mention Lenny Bruce. I would like to mention Lenny Bruce. If it was him who said counting bad things and good things, and he said that things that he liked, all of them are Jewish, and things that he disliked were not Jewish, were Goyish. So for me, it's wonderful Jewish humor, and all of him was wonderfully Jewish.
Yeah, and I think honestly, part of what makes me so fascinated by in looking at this corpus of Jewish jokes from the 1860s through 1920s, kind of old jokes that are often in dialect, I find that the ones that appeal to me, they seem still funny, they seem worth talking about, are these jokes that are about language and recognition and enregisterment and speech style. And I think that that's the theme in that first era of Jewish jokes that persisted. So when you have, in the US, you get a kind of revival of Jewish humor in the 50s and 60s. And that's, I think, what Lenny Bruce comes out of, Woody Allen, and I think what they pick up on in Jewish humor is that sort of language, speech style, recognition, misrecognition. And of course, Lenny Bruce identifying, New York is Jewish. If you come from New York, you're Jewish, even if you're Italian. If you come from North Dakota, you're Goyish, even if you're Jewish. Yeah.
You asked for Jewish jokes, and you spoke a lot about the linguistic problems. It was something new for me. Of course, it's an old story. I found suddenly in the memoirs of one of the leaders of the Russian Bund, Vladimir Medem. He lived as a political immigrant in Switzerland, in Bern. And Bern was overcrowded by Russian students who were students in the Bern University. And everybody knew. It was like an immigrant colony, yes. We lived in special hotels, or dormitories, and so on. And burghers were very much surprised why Russian language is absolutely or very close to Schweizerdeutsch. Now you understand.
Yeah.
The explanation is clear?
Yes. Yeah, so Medem is wonderful. Medem is like Shalom Aleichem. I think he's very sensitive to this question of enregisterment. He kind of sees it happening. He picks up on it. He's very interested in speech style, and he's definitely someone who valorizes Jewish speech style and who says, you know, in Switzerland, in Bern, you know, the Jewish students, they walk around, they're so loud, the Swiss hate it. You know, and it just sounds so much like Shalom Aleichem saying, look how we're so loud. You know, it's a valorization of non-standard speech. But it's not only Medem. I think this is a kind of an attitude that other Russian kind of revolutionaries had at the turn of the century, precisely in these Swiss university towns where you had a lot of Russian students, Russian Jewish students especially, walking around on the street, you know, speaking, being audible, being loud. And it was a time and place where Russian intellectuals, and especially Russian revolutionaries, are very interested in speech style because they want to know, how do you speak effectively so that you can get people to rebel against the government, right? Maybe you should speak loud and emotionally in kind of a more Jewish way. So I think there's a kind of political undertone to the valorization of Jewish speech style, specifically at that time in that place. And I also think there's something really interesting about Switzerland, and as a space with a lot of different languages, maybe Switzerland is a place where people are more aware of kind of the humor that comes from the juxtaposition of languages. And to me, it's very interesting that Uriel Weinreich, so not Max Weinreich, but his son Uriel, also a linguist, did his doctoral dissertation in Switzerland and wrote there about language contact, right, sort of founded contact linguistics, right, and maybe in a sense, Weinreich was always thinking about Yiddish and the kind of the multiple language world that he was the most familiar with, but Switzerland was a very good kind of substitute for that. So, any other questions or jokes?
I don't know if you did any research in Israeli jokes, but would you say, are there any Israeli Jewish jokes at all?
Oh, you know, I think there are. I think there are Israeli Jewish jokes. I've heard Israeli Jewish jokes. I don't know if I think that in a sense, so that the Israeli Jewish jokes that I've heard and kind of found funny were told to me by Israelis in the U.S., right? So maybe there was for them, and often I think they were about Israelis in the U.S. So in that way, they're more like the Goldberg joke, right? They're kind of Israeli jokes, but they're still about migration. I think that, of course, there's Israeli humor, but maybe Ruth Wise has a point that that perhaps there's a way in which Israeli jokes told in Hebrew in Israel might not tend to have that sort of hypersensitivity to the situation of the migrant that I've been arguing is characteristic of the kind of enregisterment of Jewish voice in spaces outside of Israel. So, yeah. Any others? Oh, yes.
First, a joke, then a question. Okay.
Good.
This is another one of the Telegram jokes.
Oh, yes, I love Telegram jokes.
In English, but I heard it in Polish. Okay, but it should work in English too. The father of the family got really sick. He just left by himself to, let's say, to Krakow, and after the consultation with the doctor, he sends a telegram home. And the telegram says, doctor said operate. Operate? He gets the same telegram back. Doctor said operate? Operate.
Yes. Yes, yes, lovely, lovely.
And, there is a question. This is maybe not a joke, but a stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
In the U.S., there is a stereotype of a Jewish mother, okay, which is overprotective and putting herself last in the order of things, etc. Mm-hmm. And I heard some years ago that the equivalent stereotype in Israel is Polish mother.
Yeah, yeah, lovely. Any other comments, questions, jokes? No? Okay. Maybe I will try to tell a joke in Russian. Okay. So this joke it's a joke about the Leningrad area. And it assumes, it assumes you know something about the geography of Leningrad, of St. Petersburg. Okay. Евреи говорят, и вот обсуждают такой вопрос, который интересует евреев. Вот. Какие там важные евреи в мире? И один говорит, знаешь, вот, самый важный еврей – это Маркс. Другие, да, важный, умный еврей. Но есть и другие. Вот Фрейд, да, Фрейд, умный еврей. А еще важнее, еще умнее Ломоносов. Ломоносов? Разве он еврей? Да он же был Ораниенбаум. So should I tell it in English? So you have some Jews. They're sitting around discussing this question that interests Jews. Who are some important Jews in the world? Important, smart Jews. And one of them says, Marx. Yeah, Marx, good, smart Jew. Another one says, Freud. Oh, yeah, Freud. And another one says, hey, Lomonosov. Lomonosov? Why? He wasn't Jewish. And then the other one, the one who argued for Lomonosov, says, but he used to be Oranienbaum. So this works if you know that the park and the palace outside of St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, Oranienbaum, was renamed Lomonosov. So this is, I think, a very typical Jewish joke, given my criteria. It fits into the kind of subgenre of Jewish jokes that interest me, in that it's about recognition, misrecognition, enregisterment, right? Enregisterment, because what is it that Jews talk about? They talk about smart Jews. And also it's about, as we started, right? The very first question I asked is, what makes the Goldberg joke Jewish? And one of you said, the name, Goldberg, right? So that sensitivity to Jewish names, which itself, of course, can be false, right? So Oranienbaum, I'm sad to tell you, is not a Jewish name. But it can be recognized as a Jewish name, and that's kind of what's important. Yeah.
It's a joke about Jews in FSU.
Mm-hmm.
So I can tell it in Russian, and maybe you or maybe I will translate it into English. Значит, анекдот такой. Встречается еврей из Кишинева с евреем из, скажем, Таллина. Он говорит, ты помнишь, брат, какие были времена? когда-то ты был еврей из Кишинева, а я был еврей из Сталина, а сейчас мы оба русскоязычное население.
So, two Jews meet. One of them is from Kishinev, one is from Thailand, and one of them says to the other, "Oh, you know, times have changed. Times have changed. Тепло у меня?"
Do you remember there were times where you are a Jew from Kishinev?
Do you remember? Once I was a Jew from Kishinev, and you were a Jew from Thailand, and now we are just the Russian-speaking population.
And as I'm a psychotherapist, I would like to tell one more joke. And it is about American and about New York Jews this time. So Mr. Greenblatt and Mrs. Greenblatt and Mrs. Goldberg, of course, are very close friends, and it means for New York that they meet once a month for lunch. And one of them asked the question about the son of the other one, and said, well, it's okay with my son. But you know, he's going to the psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist said that he has Oedipus complex. Oedipus, Schmedipus, the most important thing is that he loves mommy.
Yes, excellent. Okay, so are we at the end of our time? I think we're done. Okay, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And please come up to me afterwards and tell me more Jewish jokes.